Welcome to the Avenue Bookstore podcast, coming to you from New York City. On today's edition, I'm speaking to internationally acclaimed author and critic Siri Hustvedt. Siri is best known for her works of fiction, including the 2003 bestseller What I Loved. This month, Siri's back with another art world mystery in her new novel, The Blazing World. This book tells the provocative story of the artist Harriet Burden. After years of seeing her work dismissed by critics, Harriet decides to hide her identity behind three male fronts who exhibit her work as their own. I caught up with Siri at her home in Brooklyn, where we spoke about women in art, the Ern Malley affair, and the fundamental mysteries of existence. Siri Hustvedt, welcome to the Avenue Bookstore podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I thought it would be fitting to begin our chat with the opening quote from The Blazing World. Not only because it makes sense to start at the beginning, obviously, but also because it sets the tone so perfectly for what's to come. You write, "All intellectual and artistic endeavours, even jokes, ironies and parodies, fare better in the mind of the crowd when the crowd knows that somewhere behind the great work or the great spoof, it can locate a cock and a pair of balls."
Yes.
These are the terrific opening words of our protagonist, Harriet Burden. Siri, could you begin perhaps by telling me a little bit about Harriet? What kind of a person is she?
Yes. Well, that sentence is a quote from Harriet. The book itself is being introduced by an editor, I.V. Hess, who begins his or her, we don't know the sex of the editor, introduction with that quote. Rather vulgar quote. But Harriet herself, unlike the editor, who's a cool academic character, Harriet is a hot, burning artist, and she has a lot of anger about what she feels has been the neglect and treatment of women in the art world. So I think it is an appropriate beginning.
I agree. Well, you mentioned the structure. Can we talk a little bit more about that? Because it really is ingeniously presented. Perhaps explain to the listener just how the book is structured.
Yeah. The conceit of the book, and we know it from the very beginning, is that the central character, Harriet Burden, is dead. And the book then is a compilation of texts about Harriet. Both her children write, her lover in the last years of her life writes about her, her best friend, and then others who are more distant, some art historians, reviewers. There are a few interviews in the book that the editor conducts with various people. So that's the idea, that this is an anthology, in a way, of texts about this artist.
And it really does read like a non-fiction book. At times I caught myself when I was doing my research. I wanted to follow up on,
well, there
on
are
interviews that are mentioned that don't actually exist.
Yes, there are footnotes that the editor does for Harriet's texts, only for her text, because she has a tendency to leap from one discipline to another and make sometimes cryptic comments that this poor editor tries to track down. And then there are some lengthy footnotes, some of which, of course, are actually taken from various works of art and works of scholarship, and others are invented.
Well, Harriet has a pretty tough time in the New York art world. She's basically denigrated and ignored. She believes as a result of her being female. Do you think that it's more difficult for female artists and writers to gain recognition even today?
Yes, Harriet is older even than I am. I'm 59. She dies in 2004 at age 64. I wanted her to come from a generation somewhat ahead of me, if you will.
Okay.
So that she experiences second wave feminism after I did, and that she grew up in a world where male and female roles were even more highly defined than they are now. I think they remain so, but more so when she was growing up. The statistics that are cited at one point in the book, that only about 18 to 20% of all one-person shows in New York City are by women, remains true. You know, the numbers fluctuate somewhat, but it isn't anywhere close to 50%. The other important, I think, aspect of all this that tells us about the art market is that men's work is much more expensive than women's. Even the most famous female artists, someone like Louise Bourgeois, who commands enormous prices, is nevertheless much cheaper than the most expensive man. So this is about value and what is valued. Rather than fighting on, Harry withdraws from the art world and devises an experiment or scheme to show her work behind 3 male masks, 3 actual living human beings who show the work for her. The results are mixed, to say the least. She does get more attention as men, but Harry, I think, also has a streak of self-sabotage in her, and she has a very complicated personality. So the book is, in some ways, and it certainly is a feminist book, and it is in some ways a feminist parallel, but it's not an easy feminist parable.
Was it difficult for you to write from so many different points of view? I mean, you're writing as young men, old men, young women.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun, and at some point in the novel, I began to think of it as my multiple personality disorder book, because the voices of the characters are very different. And I began to feel, I suppose, what actors feel when they go from one role to another, that you inhabit very different voices. Of course, my body was not involved, but the voices appeared, and I did not write all of one character at one time and then move to another, because the book has what I think of as an organic form, and I needed to feel the shifts between voices as I went along.
Can you tell me a little bit about the title of the book, The Blazing World? Where does it come from?
The Blazing World is stolen from Margaret Cavendish, a 17th century natural philosopher, poet, and playwright. She also wrote a utopian fantasy called The Blazing World. Cavendish is one of the most fascinating historical characters that I've ever encountered. I got deeply involved in reading her work not so long ago. A few years ago, I had heard of her, but when I really entered into this extraordinary writing and personality, I knew that she was a good reference for this particular book, because Harry forms a strong identification with Cavendish. It's important to understand that she was, she was a wealthy woman, the Duchess of Newcastle, in a very wonderful marriage to a man who supported her, the Duke. And at the same time, and she knew Gassendi, she knew Descartes, she knew Hobbes, but none of them would enter into discussions with her that she deeply and dearly wanted. And in some of her writings, she invents interlocutors for herself to have these philosophical conversations. And she wrote really brilliantly, I think, about natural philosophy in ways that anticipate certain current ideas in neuroscience and phenomenology. So I fell in love with not just the woman, but her ideas. She was mocked, she was ridiculed, and yet 300 years after her death, she really has been resurrected.
Well, this novel, like many of your others, looks at the fluidity of identity. It also highlights the associated difficulty that is truly knowing another person. Pretty early on in the novel, we discover, or Harriet discovers, and we do too, that her husband, Felix Lord, has been having an affair with another couple. What is it about the issues of identity and knowing that really fascinate you?
Well, I suppose that I think of this as a fundamental mystery of our existence. We're not only strangers to each other, we're also strangers to ourselves. There's a great deal that we are not aware of. And the book, to some degree, treats these issues too, issues of mind, embodied mind, or, theoretical questions about what we actually are. But betrayal is probably one of the most pointed ways of investigating the question of the other, right? If you think you know someone and suddenly you discover that the person has another life, and this is a sophisticated couple. In other words, Harriet or Harry tolerates these affairs and even has sympathy for her husband, but that doesn't make it easy for her.
Well, perhaps now might be a good time to hear you read a passage from the book. Tell us what we're about to hear now.
This is after Harry has told about the death of her husband, and she's describing her move to Brooklyn. She's been living on the Upper East Side, and she's, in a sense, running away from her former life.
Okay.
I crossed the bridge and bought a building in Brooklyn, a scruffier borough in those days than it is now. I wanted to flee the Manhattan art world, that incestuous, moneyed, whirring globule composed of persons who buy and sell aesthetic objets. In that effete microcosm, it is fair to say Felix had been a giant, dealer to the stars, and I, Gargantua's artist wife. Wife outweighed artist, however, and with Felix gone, the inhabitants of that beau monde cared little whether I stayed or left them for the remote region known as Red Hook. I had had 2 dealers. Both had dropped me, one after the other. My work had never sold much and was little discussed, but for 30 years I served as hostess to the lot of them, the collectors, the artists, and the art writers, a mutually dependent club so ingrown and overgrown that their identities seemed to merge. By the time I bid goodbye to it all, the hot new properties fresh from art school had begun to look alike to me, with their film or performance art and their pretentious patter and garbled theoretical references. At least the kids were hopeful. They took their cues from the hopeless, those morons who wrote for Art Assembly, the hermetic rag that regularly served up the cold leftovers of French literary theory to its eager, equally ignorant readers. For years I worked so hard to hold my tongue I nearly swallowed it. For years I had slid around the dining room table in various costumes of the bright, eccentric variety opposite the clay, directing traffic with deft signals and smiling, always smiling.
Well, you don't paint a very charming picture of the New York art world. Is it really all that bad?
Well, I think there are aspects of every world, probably in many big urban centers. You know, when I was a child, I read Balzac, a young girl rather, and it bore no resemblance to my world in Minnesota in a small town. But the older I've gotten, the more I've come to see that Balzac really was talking about a world that exists, and it does exist here. Money talks, fame talks, and a lot of people are run over in a rush to those things, to wealth and glory.
Mm. Many of your books are either set in the art world or deal with art directly. What is it about art that you love and that just keeps you coming back to it again and again as a subject?
I think what interests me is the difference between the visual and the verbal. They really are different. They function in different ways. Language is sequential, and a painting, for example, is not. It's static, it's fixed. It exists in our time, in subjective time, but everything in a painting is there all at once. So I think in the two books where I've really explored art, this one, The Blazing World, and in What I Loved, I enjoyed immensely creating, verbal works of art or describing works of art that I would have liked to have made myself were I doing that for a living. The return to that, I think, is to present the mystery of visual works of art in their complexity in a verbal form that may tell us something about the characters that the artist doesn't know him or herself. I mean, I think this about literature too. I like to say the book knows more than I do.
Well, it's funny.
Funny.
You should mention that. It's funny. Because I was struck by a comment by one of your characters in the book, Cynthia Clark, a gallery owner. She says that many artists are not able to speak well about their art and that the pressure put upon artists to explain themselves is misplaced. How do you feel about speaking to people about your own work?
Well, I think every listener has to qualify my comments. In other words, after a book is finished, in some funny way, you learn how to talk about it because the book is the book. And the first interview after a book has been published is always strange because I have no idea what to say. And then you grope and you find comments that you can make. You believe them to be honest. But at the same time, I think the creation of a book is a mysterious business, and where these people come from, how the structure of the book evolves, it's extremely difficult to talk about.
The premise of The Blazing World is, of course, Harriet's great hoax on the art world, where she presents her own work behind three male fronts. In the book, you outline a strong history of these identity hoaxes in the arts, and I was thrilled to see that even our own Ern Malley gets a mention.
Yes. I think that's one of the great literary hoaxes of all time.
It's a terrific
Yeah.
one. What do you think these hoaxes say about us as a society more generally? I mean, why are people so easily taken in by them?
Well, I think that it's more about the nature of human perception. In other words, every single person is vulnerable to being hoaxed. I don't think a single one of us is hoax. What has a hoax like prophylactic, inbuilt? We're pretty trusting creatures. The social contract is that we believe one another. At the same time, what's funny, what thrills us about these hoaxes is that it does seem to reveal judgments about, say, works of art that are based on, maybe not the work itself, but on other aspects of perception, certain biases that we all have. I really do believe that a feminine author or feminine, artist who the name, a female name attached to a work of art, does have a certain polluting value, and that a masculine name has an enhancing value. I think this is absolutely true. On the other hand, there are other aspects or other qualities that also are enhancing fame, for example, in celebrity. You know, you see this, and anyone who lives in a big city knows that celebrity lights up a room. And money. My character, Harry, has money. And to some degree, she takes it for granted.
The money thing really is important to Harry's character too, because that's also how she gets access to her first two artists, isn't it? She pays them to be a part of this great hoax with her.
Exactly. So that gives her power that she couldn't possibly have had under other circumstances had she been poor. It also gives her some edge over her lover, Bruno, who is not rich. So money does play an important part in this book too.
Well, we know that you're a novelist, you're an art critic, an essayist, and a researcher in the areas of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. I'm curious as to why, in a world of increasing specialisation, you've chosen to buck that trend.
First of all, I think it's fair to say because I can. I'm not a member of the academy. I don't have to keep up in any field. I am free to read, and I read several hours a day. And that is a hugely liberating position to have, so I can follow my nose wherever it takes me, and many people do not have that freedom. So it's important to state that. And then I don't know, but I am wildly curious. I remain wildly curious, and because no single theoretical model about human beings, it seems to me, can encompass the complexity that is us, I keep roaming around in various disciplines to see what each of them has to say about us.
What do you think, Siri, for you is the key to telling a great story?
This is such a good question. My husband and I like to quote Mickey Spillane, the crime writer, who we met as a very old man many years ago in Sweden. Okay. He said a beautiful thing. He said, "No one ever reads a book to get to the middle." And that's true. I think that the key to telling stories is to maintain the urgency of the text. It's strange because I'm reading To the Lighthouse now. It is a book in which not all that much happens. It is not a plot-driven book, but the urgency is totally present. You want to know. You want to move to the next page, even though Woolf has not set up some elaborate plot structure. So there's something in the writing itself that creates urgency, creates a tempo of necessity. I would love to know exactly what that is, how that works. But there's no question that every good book has it. Yeah.
Well, Siri, just finally, what can we expect from you next? Do you have another novel in the works?
I am not writing another novel, but I am slowly cooking it up. I actually made a wrong turn. I started a book and I realized that I was writing the wrong book. I was actually trying to write sort of the anti-Harry book, which was a little tiny, shy man. And I realized that he was too boring, that I wasn't interested in him enough. So I have another book that is simmering in my mind, and day by day it appears to be growing. So at some point I will begin writing it. I need to know enough about the central person to do it. And of course it has to be different from what I've done before.
Well, we're all eagerly awaiting it.
Well, thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Siri.
And I had fun too. Thanks.
That was Siri Hustvedt speaking about her forthcoming novel, The Blazing World. This book is published by Hachette and will be available at the Avenue Bookstore from the 11th of March. I'm Anna Taylor. Thanks for listening to the Avenue Bookstore podcast.